Welcome to the Yoga of Healing and Awakening Summit, a free online event where you'll discover essential depth teachings and daily practices for your mind, body, and soul. Share these visionary masters and esteemed practitioners with your friends and family, and join us on Facebook at the Shift Network. And now your host, Cindy Lee.
Welcome, everyone. We're so glad that you're joining us, and I'm really excited to introduce our special guest today, Jacoby Ballard. Jacoby has been teaching yoga for 2 decades and is a leader in yoga service work, bringing a social justice approach to yoga communities. He founded Third Root Community Health Center in Brooklyn and Bending Toward Justice, and has consulted with Insight Meditation Society, Harvard University, Lululemon, and Yoga Alliance. And Jacoby currently teaches in Salt Lake City. So glad you could be here today, Jacoby. Welcome.
Thanks so much, Cindy. It's great to see you.
It's great to see you too. So, you've been teaching yoga for over 20 years. And yes. You've seen that a lot of us love our yoga practice as a way to reduce stress, increase strength, increase flexibility, get a sense of spaciousness for ourselves. But you also talk about that as just being maybe part of the bigger potential of yoga. And I wondered if you could talk about that potential and how you think it's being offered or could be offered in a broader application.
Yeah, thank you for that. I've been doing social justice work as well for about 20 years. And, I found it so interesting that both yoga and social justice talk about liberation. And for a long time, I kind of parsed out that they were talking about different things. Within yoga, liberation meant a certain kind of freedom from the world, perhaps, or separation from the world. And within social justice, liberation meant that, everyone can be whole and in integrity and thrive despite their own identity and life experience and skills. But the more that my study of yoga deepened and I saw it influence my life and my work, the more that I saw social justice workers burning out. And before we could ever begin to reach liberation, the more I thought that they're actually talking about the same thing from two different approaches. One working kind of externally on things that create suffering, in the ways that we create suffering for each other in this world, and the ways that that's perpetuated. And yoga talking more about like our internal process around that suffering and how we can change and shift that process in order to have a more skillful relationship with the suffering and sorrow in our world. It's complicated, right? Because yoga, the history of yoga is complicated, coming from India, and then also dynamics of power in India and how yoga was brought to the West and what it's meant and how it's manifested in the West. That I don't necessarily think it's fair to say that like yoga has always been about liberation, because it depends who's practicing it and to what ends they're using it. I mean, we see, the Buddhists in Myanmar killing people. So any religion or spiritual practice can be used, I think, for connection or separation, and for fear or love. But I think the internal process of yoga is so important to liberation work, to create the change that we want to see in the world, and for that change to be sustainable. And it can't end with the work that we do on ourselves. So often I would see in yoga classes, in so many different spaces, people like roll out their mat with like a thwap on the floor and just like totally jolt the person next to them, which is like something really minor, but it is a way that we're not necessarily caring for the space that we're holding together, and creating equal opportunity for everyone to feel safe and welcome and whole in our yoga spaces. And then, you know, different things can expand from there, from like experiences of racism or transphobia or ableism. And so if we don't directly encounter those samskaras in ourselves, then we're bound to repeat them, even in our yoga spaces where we want and just talk about and aspire to liberation.
Yeah. And it's, you know, it's not that comfortable, you know, even when we recognize that in ourselves, like the flapping of the mat, you know, in yoga class. I mean, you used to come to my yoga studio, and probably remember that we had, we sort of had a system where if people were late, they waited outside the door until the teacher opened the door.
Yeah.
And at the beginning, when we did that and people came in, maybe there would be one person coming in late, but there might be 10 people. And the people that were already there would get irritated. And over time, from just, you know, sort of enforced practice, but then it became embodied. When people came in late, they were like, hey, here's some space. And by the way, do you need a block? And, you know, it shifted, but it's not so comfortable always. Even these little things, you know, are planting seeds.
Yeah, and I think it's up to the yoga teacher as space holder to handle that moment of discomfort. Yeah. Often when someone enters my class late, and people have to reorganize their mats, and they might be in a tiff about that. You know, I talk about how lovely that another friend has entered the room that wants to practice yoga for much the same reasons that each of us do. And so of course we're going to make room, and of course we're glad you're here.
Yeah, exactly. It can be that simple, that pure. So another thing that I like that you have done is talk about the yamas and the niyamas as kind of a bridge between yoga philosophy, and yogis, and taking that into social change. Can you talk about that a little?
Yeah, I think that if we all followed, especially so the yama as like an external practice, kind of about being in right relationship with each other. And then I talk about the niyamas as the ways that we need to be with ourselves in order to accomplish that we are grounded enough that we can approach other relationships skillfully. So the practice of nonviolence, right? We live in a really violent world, and the ways that we manifest that can be through thoughts, words, or actions. And there's so many ways that if we're not aware and we're not self-reflective, we can perpetuate the racism that we're swimming in, or the xenophobia, or any number of ideas that we've just kind of been handed and indoctrinated into. And so in that way, I think that ahimsa is really a radical practice, to not recycle the harms of this world, and to know that like that can stop here, and then how I think, speak, and act can be from a place of love, but only if I'm practicing the niyamas, right? And make sure that like there's cleanliness here, there's self-reflection here, there's a sense of contentment here that I'm not grasping. And then I also think asteya is a really important one, given that we live on stolen land. And
can you tell the listeners what ahimsa and asteya mean?
Yeah, ahimsa, nonviolence, and asteya, non-stealing. There's been so much theft in our world, and it's largely how capitalism has built capital, is through stolen labor and stolen land. And so again, if we're practicing non-stealing, then that necessitates a practice of reparations for the damage that's been done through theft, and to repair then relationships between white folks and indigenous folks, between white folks and black folks, between any number of communities whose labor or whose resources in their home country have been stolen, I think is a really radical, but we don't often in yoga spaces think about it that way or take it that deep, because it can be really uncomfortable and cause a lot of us to really question everything that we've been brought up with, right? But if we don't, we're going to continue to practice himsa, harming.
Right. Without even knowing it.
Right.
Yeah, without even knowing it. So do you think, and maybe you're doing this, like, what is a skillful way to talk about what you're talking about, talk about the yamas and niyamas or do you think it would be skillful to talk about it in an asana class? Because,
yeah,
obviously some people are going to be like, don't harsh my mellow,
totally.
but it from another point of view, it's like, that's what we're practicing for.
Right. And who has the privilege to have a mellow in the first place? And how many people walking into the room never have access to that because the world is so harsh to them. Right. Yeah, I absolutely think there's ways to incorporate it into an asana class. I usually teach with themes that are based on yoga and Buddhist philosophies, because I think it's really a shame that yoga in the West has become solely a physical practice, and it's missing out on so many thousands of years where the practice was like just an iota of what the practice has been over time. And so if we don't even know about the philosophies, I think it's a huge disservice to where yoga has come from, to the practice of yoga, to all of the rishis and sages and gurus who have passed on the teachings. So many times when I introduce, right now I'm teaching about the chakras, and people know about them like pretty superficially, but there's so much that they don't understand because teachers haven't taught about them, even though it's an integral part to our yoga practice. And the same with the yamas and niyamas. So in my teaching practice, I go through themes, the many lists that there are, and just again and again, like every year I teach the yamas, and every year I teach the chakras, and every year I teach the precepts in Buddhism, and just to kind of instill in my yoga students that the yoga practice is so much broader and deeper. And what I hear from my students is that it's really causing them to reflect on things that maybe they haven't wanted to look at or known that they should look at. It's improved their relationships, which is one of the things that my colleague Hala Corey says, your yoga is working if your relationships are improving.
Yeah.
So I think it's, I don't think it's harshing the mellow. I think it's deepening the practice, and that it's trusting our students and their practice and the practice as a whole to be able to hold that depth. So in that way, I think it's a great honoring of our students to pass on the philosophies.
Absolutely. And, I love that you said you do this every year, because yoga is, whether it's the asana practice or the philosophy, it's not like, I don't know, gymnastics or golf or something. Like you go, okay, I learned how to play golf. I got to hit, what's that called? The hole in one, and done. Now I can do something else. You can look at these every day. You can look at them every year, and it will get richer and richer. And I would imagine your students are just, really grateful to you for teaching that, for sharing that approach.
Yeah, and it's really amazing how relevant they always are, right? Like teaching about brahmacharya in the midst of the Me Too movement. Brahmacharya is watching our sexual energies and really valuing the power of our sexual energies, and so therefore practicing ahimsa with those energies, which is what women all over the world are calling for. And not just recognition of the harm caused in this moment, but how that's been ingrained in our society as a whole, and it's historical. It's not just harm that's happening now. I think it's really powerful that, you know, whatever is arising in our popular culture or political environment, these teachings are so, I've come to really rely on the relevance of these teachings, that there's always going to be grappling with our attachment to things, right? Or the way that we might have greed around like acquiring even, or like going on the next yoga retreat can be like a practice of like clinging and like being like, if I just go on this retreat with Cindy Lee, then like, then my practice is really going to be like deep and enlightened, and like, won't everyone know just because I'll post it on Facebook that I was there.
Yeah, then we're going down the rabbit hole.
Right.
Yeah. So I know another class you've been teaching, and maybe this is the class you were talking about, but for over a decade, is queer and trans yoga.
Yeah.
And, I would love to hear you tell us why that space is needed and how the rest of us can support that.
Thank you. Yeah, it's, you know, I dream of the day where it's not needed. So that's the long view, is when yoga for LGBT communities, when yoga for Black folks, for Desi folks of Indian descent are no longer needed. But in the moment they're needed because harm often happens in mixed environments, either by other students holding the space or by the teachers themselves, out of lack of awareness or, you know, lack of having guidance themselves from their own teachers and being challenged. So I created the class in 2006, shortly after I worked at a natural food store that was connected to a yoga ashram in New York, and got fired for being trans. And I thought it was so interesting that it's like this yogic organization where I answer the phone saying, how can I serve? And yet, you know, and there's all these like presumptions I had that it would be like wonderful working for yoga organizations because of the yamas and niyamas. And of course we would have a depth of practice, and that would be part of the work there. But in fact, it wasn't, and it was really heartbreaking, but also really illuminating. And I'm grateful for that like yoga wasn't in a place in 2006 to be able to hold the like wholeness of a trans person working at their natural food store. So, but I knew that the practice had value to me. And I'd also been to like a number of yoga classes where like things were said either directly about trans people. I remember sitting with one well-known teacher in New York talking about karma and how trans people are not living up to our karma as like the sex that we were born into. So then we're like trying to escape. So there's all these like interesting intersections of the teachings with transphobia or racism or sexism that can happen if we're not aware. And so I just wanted to like pull all my community in and like create a safer place, which is not to say that I don't recycle any of those same, you know, societal harms, but I am aware of them, and I do have a practice of asking for forgiveness, and I do have a practice of acknowledging when I've said or done something unskillfully or that's created harm. And it's been really beautiful to see students come to queer and trans yoga just because they want a queer space to be in. I've had a number of students who have just come out, and it's like their first queer event to go to queer and trans yoga, which is so sweet. And then they get all the yoga teachings in their queer space, which then really, I think, deepens their experience as a queer person, as someone coming out, as someone facing, you know, judgment from family or targeting by the society, or, you know, facing that there's so much suicide in our community. It's just like a space to help us process everything that we're dealing with as queer folks, which is the same thing from like, there's a yoga class at Third Root now, Brown Sugar, that's just for folks of color. And it's this, very similar idea that like it's a space to just hold everything that's getting tossed their way, with the wisdom of the yoga teachings. And then that's part of my work out of queer and trans yoga, as people were asking, why is this space needed? Isn't that exclusive? Or like, straight students being like, wow, man, that class time of 8 p.m. on Thursdays where you teach the queer and trans yoga class, that's really convenient to me. And I know gay people, I have gay friends, can I come to class? And just having to, gently say, in this moment, I want to ask you to be an ally and protect that space for just us. Realize that if we're asking for it, if we're putting it on, it is needed, and to trust that, and to maybe see how you can support it rather than how you can resist it, as a way. And if you can support it, one of the ways you can support it, right, is talk about homophobia and transphobia and heterosexism in your own communities and families and neighborhoods, so that all the other yoga classes, maybe 20 years down the road, are queer friendly. It'll be obsolete. I dream of that day.
Yeah, for sure.
But until we all do the work, and not just queer folks, but we need our straight allies to do that work, it's going to be needed.
Yeah. And it's so interesting what you said about how we can, I don't think of this so much in yoga, but of course it's there. I think of it more in, other kinds of religions, and not that yoga is exactly a religion, but it's a spiritual philosophy and life, and filter, and that we can sort of wrap ourselves in this and then just do the same old shit,
Yeah.
but with, but it's because of, this yama or that yama. And if we can twist it or, just mush it without changing anything, without really embodying, and I think what you're talking about is really super helpful. Just even to say to someone, could you be our ally? And can you trust that we need this? Is so beautiful. And at the same time, you're giving trust. You're saying you could trust us, and you could trust yourself to trust us,
Yeah.
Yeah.
And it'd be beautiful. I mean, I lead queer and trans yoga retreats every year in upstate New York, and I would love to see the day where like that space is so valued by our larger yoga community that straight allies sponsor scholarships to it, for like young queer folks of color or trans women or other like marginalized aspects of our identity that can't make it to that retreat because of the room and board costs, where that is like those people are cared for by the larger community. And I've said the same thing to the Black Yoga Teachers Association, that like white allies should like step up and try to and support that space and provide scholarships for that space, because if they're putting it on, then of course it's needed. And so how can we use our power and privilege to build relationship rather than be like, how dare you like create your own space?
Yeah, no. No. I mean, I totally get this. And I can even think of it for myself. I like to be in spaces with just women, and I'm married to a man. I like men, but it's a different thing, and it's needed. And should be very clear, but I love that idea of creating scholarships, and I'm gonna think about that a lot. I like that. So would you call that yoga service? Or what does yoga service mean these days?
It can mean a lot of different things. I mean, it comes, the tradition of, there's a lineage of yoga in India, karma yoga and seva, that is service. So service has always been part of the yoga lineage. So in that way, it's very historical and ancestral. yoga service has kind of become a realm of work in the US in the last 10 or 15 years, encompassing groups of people that teach in prisons, in recovery centers, to teach to survivors of sexual violence, in schools, to veterans, detention centers, teaching at the border, basically bringing yoga to communities that are suffering, who would never enter a yoga studio for a lot of the reasons that we've just talked about. And it's been done, there's been a couple different strands of it. Some of it is folks like me who are a part of a community and wanting to build space for our own community. So I would include the Black Yoga Teachers Association in that, or all the people around the country that teach fat yoga or curvy yoga or yoga for bigger bodies or Buddha body yoga. There's all these manifestations of it. I would call all of that yoga service. And then it's also been bringing yoga across difference. So for me to go in and teach in a prison, I've never been incarcerated. I don't have family members that have been incarcerated. But I do now have a lot of friends who have been incarcerated or are in prison right now, just because I've built those relationships. But me going into that space, now there's trainings for how to do that skillfully, because there's a lot that I would never know is part of that life experience, that I could be perpetuating harm and separation without knowing it, or perpetuating projection. So now there's trainings to teach in all these different spaces, which is really amazing. And there's more and more work around our own positionality and privilege and going into some of these different spaces, and what do any one of us need to look at if we're teaching to a community that's not our own. There's a lot of things that we need to do to be really careful. And also, because it's not our own community, there's going to be inevitably things that we don't understand. And there's going to be harm there. And so then what are our practices of reconciliation and forgiveness when we've made an error and a mistake? And how do we create space for those students inside a prison or recovering from addiction, or even inside a school? How do I create space for a 4-year-old to tell me, like, ouch, that hurts, or I can't sit still, or whatever it is, to give the feedback and not just be like the yoga teacher, the authority in the room that's like commanding and kind of playing Simon Says, but we're in relationship, I think is more where yoga service is getting to now, more self-examination, and the relationship as part of our yoga, not just the offering of the asana.
Yeah. And I so appreciate you saying that we can have a practice of asking for forgiveness, because I think that it's easy for some of us to feel afraid to want to help, because I might do the wrong thing, I might say the wrong thing, and so maybe I should just stay out of it, and that's not really the answer either.
Right. Yeah, I mean, sometimes in those instances, it's, if you're not the one to do the thing, to teach in that environment, then how do you support the people who are? Well-known social justice organizer Malachi Garza talks about flanking, which is the practice of showing up in support of a space. He's Latino and talks about flanking Black Lives Matter. So showing up and providing childcare, providing food, doing whatever that supports the space as a whole, even if he's not the one leading the space, and that fellowship is an essential practice. But also I think it is worth really examining, like, what kinds of people do you have relationships with? What kinds of people are in your life? And what kinds of people do you not know? Like, do you not know undocumented immigrants? Why? Where have you been? Or what is the separation that you're inadvertently participating in that keeps you out of relationship with undocumented folks or trans folks or sex workers, or, whatever it is. And I think for me, slowly forging relationships with different kinds of communities but being also careful not to tokenize, like, I want to be your friend just because you're undocumented, but to like trust, like, if I show up to your events, your film screening, if I show up to you're speaking out at a Sanctuary City event, that relationship will form. And then there will be friendship, and then we'll see what we could perhaps do together.
That's great advice. That's really, really helpful. And it kind of, I think it is bringing us full circle in a way where we talked about, that there is, of course, an aspect of yoga that is for ourselves, and that's important, and we have to start there. And asking these questions that you just brought up, like, why don't I know an undocumented worker? Is, you have to look inside. Am I afraid? Am I stuck? How am I stuck? Do I want to get unstuck? And going back to the yamas and the niyamas, and going back to the practice for yourself again and again, like you introduce it year in and year out.
Totally. I think Seane Corn has really demonstrated to me that when going into spaces that are uncomfortable or unfamiliar, to then like immediately to prepare for those spaces by doing your practice before you go, and then also to come back to the practice to sit with whatever arose, so that you're not just then going to either bury it or be in a place of reactivity because of where you've just been.
Or ignorance, as we would say in Buddhism, which means just like spacing out and ignoring, know. Yeah. Thank you so much. This is really inspiring. I wish we could talk for hours. It's great. I do want to let people know about your websites, because I'm guessing you have do you do some trainings?
Yeah, I do. I've led some teacher trainings with Adhikara Yoga School in Massachusetts, and I'm also leading some here in Salt Lake City through 21st Yoga. But then also Bending Towards Justice as an organization that I helped to co-found that does anti-oppression trainings for yoga teachers, yoga studios, yoga service organizations. So if your studio is interested in some of these conversations, there's many of us that have been trained to like hold this space, both of social justice and the practice aspects of the conversation. And we would love to come work with you. And then Third Root Community Health Center is a really wonderful sanctuary in Brooklyn that I helped co-found, that I'm no longer an owner of, but they're doing amazing things. Really good work there. There's still a queer and trans yoga class there. There's a brown sugar yoga class. There's a yoga for abundant bodies class. And they host a variety of different workshops as well. So I would totally recommend it, even if you're just stopping through New York, to stop by Third Root.
Yeah, sounds great. So it's JacobyBallard.com,
Yep.
thirdroot.org, and I love this name, bendingtowardjustice.org.
Yeah.
Great. Thank you so much for taking the time, Jacoby. It's really great
to
talk with you.
It's great to talk to you.
Yeah, good to see you again.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you for joining the Yoga of Healing and Awakening Summit, brought to you by the Shift Network. To learn more, visit yogaofhealingsummit.com. To learn more about our global programs and events, visit theshiftnetwork.com. Thank you again for joining us and for sharing this powerful journey of yoga as a divine life path.